Okay, well, good morning, everyone, and let's begin with our prayer. We've mentioned a number of people we want to be praying for this morning, so let us pray. Sovereign God and Father, your greatness fills the heavens, your power sustains the universe, your love supports all creation, and your purpose extends to all times, all centuries, all people. And Father, we're grateful for everything you are and everything you do. Lord Jesus Christ, meet with each of us afresh today. Open our eyes to see you. Open our ears to hear you. Open our minds to know you. And open our hearts to love you, so that we may glimpse a little more of your glory and help our lives to show forth your praise. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, we're going to turn to Matthew chapter 20. And let me just remind you that Matthew, the overall theme of Matthew's gospel is that Jesus is the King of the Jews. Matthew's gospel, not exclusively, but certainly in the early days, was largely written to Jews to persuade Jews that Jesus was indeed the Messiah. He has very much a Jewish audience in mind. As I say, not exclusively. Don't run away with that idea. But, for instance, Matthew never explains the background to some of the feasts or festivals of the Jews because he doesn't need to. His target audience, the people who are reading his gospel, who are hearing it being read, are very familiar with what the Festival of Lights and the Tabernacles and the Passover and so on, what it all means. They know all of that. So here is Matthew writing from the standpoint, Jesus is the King of the Jews. It's the first question that's asked in his gospel. Remember the wise men we call the Magi? They came at Jesus' birth and they go to Herod's palace and they ask that powder keg question, where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and are come to worship him. So Matthew is a Jew writing to persuade Jews that Jesus is the King. And in this section, here is another what we call kingdom parables. Now, Matthew is full of kingdom parables where the beginning of Jesus' words are, for the kingdom of heaven is like. And you see that again and again. And this is about the last one we'll come upon in this gospel, because Jesus is just about to go to Jerusalem, just about to arrive there, and just about what we think of as Palm Sunday. Now, let me just set the scene a little bit. The details of this parable may be familiar, and you've got to understand the big picture with this parable. Because people read this parable and say, oh, that's so unfair. But try and read it and understand what it is not. It is not a lesson in industrial relations. It is not a lesson in fair pay recommendations. It's a lesson about grace, not about grapes, but about grace. So let's read it together first. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went early in the morning to hire men to work in his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. About the third hour he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, you also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right. And so they went. Then he went out again about the 6th hour and the 9th hour and did the same thing. About the 11th hour, he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing? Because no one hired us, they answered. And he said, well, you also go and work in the vineyard. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, 'Call the workers and pay their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going back to the first.' The workers who were hired about the 11th hour came, and each received a denarius. When those who were hired first, they expected to receive more, but each one of them received a denarius. Then, when they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. 'These men who were hired worked only for 1 hour,' they said, 'and you've made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the work in the heat of the day.' But he answered them, 'Friend, I am not being unfair to you. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the man who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do so, what I do with my own money? Are you so envious because I am generous? And so the last will be first, and the first last.'" Now, hang on to that last sentence, verse 16. "The last shall be first, and the first shall be last," because you're going to see where that plays out when a request is made about special privileges, special positions in the kingdom. Now, this hiring of day workers, and they were day workers, and you only needed them at harvest time. Most people who had a small holding or a farm or whatever, they worked it, their sons or whoever helped them work it, or they employed another regular worker. But at harvest time, you needed extra help. And so the pattern was you went out and you hired day workers. Sometimes it was the grape harvest, sometimes olive, sometimes wheat harvest, sometimes the barley harvest. And that's true today. A few years back, I went to El Centro. El Centro was down on the California, very close to the California-Mexican border. Heather said it wasn't the end of the world, but you could see the end of the world from it. So we went to El Centro, and one of the places we were driving around, we saw a whole bunch of guys standing in a Walmart parking lot. And I said to the guy we were with, who was a local, what are these guys? He said, "Oh, they are day workers. They come in because all around that Imperial Valley, there are farms galore, and they grow all kinds of things. Very fertile land, and they grow all sorts of crops. And so these guys come, they wait at a certain place, farmers come in, hire them to work in their fields and so on as day workers. So it's exactly the same thing. Now, what you have to understand, if you look at the beginning of the story, he went out early in the morning to hire men to work in his vineyard. That's verse 1. The Jewish day began at 6 a.m. It was a 12-hour day, dawn to dusk. It began at 6 a.m., it ended at 6 p.m. So when you hear these phrases about the third hour and so on, the ninth hour and all that kind of thing, what it's referring to is the third hour is 9 a.m., sixth hour is 12 noon, then the ninth hour is 3 p.m., and the 11th hour is what? 5 p.m. Okay? Now, look at verse 2, because only the original workers were told what they would receive. The farmer struck a deal with them. By the way, it was the normal wage for a full day's work. In Jesus' time, a denarius was what you paid a worker who worked for you for a day, whatever they were doing. That was the normal standard rate. There wasn't such a thing as a minimum wage, but that's what you got. You got a denarius. Now the rest, and you notice the farmer says it when he hires the next lot. He went out and at the third hour, so that's 9 a.m., and he says to them, "You go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." day workers would have normally said, well, it's a denarius for a day, but we only work from 9, so we're probably going to get this. So there was this expectation that the farmer would pay them pro rata, as we say, and that he would be fair. He would give them what they would expect. Now, which workers are going to be very happy in this parable? Who are the happy workers? Yeah, the happiest of all are the guys hired at 5 p.m., worked for an hour and got a day's wage. They're very happy. They're almost as happy as the people working our rummage sale. I mean, you've never seen a happier crowd than the people over there. So all of these people who were getting more than they expected are going to be very happy. Now, which workers were unhappy? The original ones, the ones hired at 6. Now, here's the point that you must not miss. I want to repeat this. It's not about grapes. It's not about federal recommendation on hiring practices. It's not about scales of day workers and what's fair and what's not fair. It's not about that. It's about grace, and you'll see the tagline at the end, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. It's talking about how in God's kingdom things are turned upside down. We'll come to that when you get to Salome's request for special privileges for her sons. But the first group of workers who were hired received justice. Okay, let's hammer that home. They were told what they were going to get. It was a normal daily wage. That's what they got. They didn't get any less than that. He didn't say, well, you didn't work very hard, so I'm going to give you half of what is the normal. No, he told them what they were going to get. He hired them. They worked. They were paid. But the people who received justice, and remember, all the workers after that, what they received was mercy and grace. Those who were treated justly actually felt that they were victims of injustice. Is that fair? But were they? Does anyone like to try and make that argument? If you say, well, I'm going to hire you, you're going to get a denarius, get out into the field and get those grapes off the vines, you get exactly what you were told you were going to get. Now, it goes down, doesn't it, to envy. It goes down to the one thing that there are certain people can put up with anything, but the thing they hate is somebody getting something they're not. They're envious of somebody getting something they're not. And it shows itself very, very clearly. Now, as I say, the whole thrust of the kingdom is that the standards of the world are turned upside down. That the people who society says are important are actually not important. And the people that society undervalues, doesn't think are anything special, they're the people who are really working for the kingdom. They're the people who are really doing a great job for God. I don't know how accurate this story is, but it's been told for a long time that when Teddy Roosevelt came back after his time in the White House, he came back, went into retirement, went to Africa and so on, and had all kinds of adventures. And when his ship got back into New York, the quayside was covered with people welcoming him home, holding banners, cheering. Reporters were there to see the former president because Teddy Roosevelt was news everywhere he went. He was news. He was this big personality. And they are all turned out. And so when he went down the gangway, the whole crowd, the whole city, it seemed, was there to welcome him. And on the same ship was a man who had been a missionary in Africa for 30 years. There was no one to welcome him. Not even the person who represented the mission that he had gone out with. They didn't even come to the boat to welcome him home. 30 years lost in Africa, working amongst the native people, helping them farm their own lands, feed their own people, helping them with medical supplies. He comes back. There's nobody to watch. That's the way society is. You know, if you're a politician, if you're a personality, if you're an actor, you get all this praise and all this attention and all this focus. If you're someone who's doing something for God, something significant and real and meaningful, you hardly get a mention. You're not going to get a mention. And the newspaper the next day was all about Teddy Roosevelt's return to his native New York. It's the same idea. And as I say, hang on to that verse 16. So the last shall be first, and the first last. Now, you move into, and verse 17, Jesus is on the journey to Jerusalem. And he took the 12 aside, and he says to them, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and teachers of the law, and they will condemn him to death and will turn him over to the Gentiles, that's the Romans, to be mocked and flogged and crucified, and on the third day will be raised to life. Now, you notice how detailed Jesus is about the prediction. I don't want you to think I'm making too much of that, but you see the business about being mocked. Remember how they did that to Jesus? Then being flogged, how they did that. Because Pilate, you remember, ordered that Jesus be flogged because he thought that would appease the Jews and that would be enough. Look, I've flogged the man for you. You know, he's no threat. He's no rebel. He's not going to raise an army. You know, I've punished him. Let that go. But they wouldn't let it go. They were pressing and pushing for Jesus' execution. And Pilate had hoped by flogging Jesus that he could escape from having to sentence Jesus to death. So Jesus tells the disciples in great detail what will happen. I'll be arrested by the chief priest. I'll be arrested by my own people, by the religious leaders in Jerusalem. Then I'll be handed over to the Romans. Then I will be mocked and I will be flogged and I will be executed. I will be crucified. On the third day I will rise from the dead. Could it be any more specific? You know, it's a mini account of everything that's going to happen in Jerusalem. Now, Mark's gospel tells us that Jesus warns the disciples 3 times about what is going to happen in Jerusalem. And the warnings come at 3 different times, in 3 different places, at 3 different occasions. And you've got to wonder, how much did the disciples process this? Did they think about it? Did they ruminate on it? I mean, we don't know. Nobody can say. But yet, when it happens, it seems to totally surprise them. And yet, you know, Jesus is trying to warn them. Now, fellas, this is going to happen. So he tells them once. A little bit later, he tells them again. And he tells them a 3rd time. And you've got to say to yourself, does it sink in? Why does it not sink in if it doesn't? And so on. Now, they didn't appear to take any notice. Now you come to a request. Look at verse 20. Then the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons, and kneeling down. Now you can picture the scene. Jesus is standing. You've got James and John and their mother kneeling before Jesus, kneeling in homage, kneeling to pay tribute to Jesus, kneeling to ask a favor of Jesus, because that's how Matthew describes it. Asking a favor. What is it you want? Jesus asked. She said, "Grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at the left in your kingdom." "You don't know what you're asking," Jesus said to them. "Can you drink the cup that I'm going to drink of?" Now, that question is addressed to the boys, okay? It's addressed to James and John. Can you drink of the cup I'm going to drink? We'll come to that in a minute. "We can," they answered. Jesus said to them, "You will indeed drink from my cup, but to sit at my right or my left is not for me to grant." Don't miss that. "These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father." You know, you sometimes hear people say, well, Jesus knew everything. And I can take you to places in the Gospels where it's very clear that Jesus didn't. There was a limit to his knowledge. For instance, when the if you want another example of that, he doesn't know at this point who's going to sit at his right and at his left. In other words, who's going to occupy the places of honor. He doesn't know this. When you get to the passages where what's called the Olivet Discourse, and it's called that because Jesus and his disciples have this whole conversation on the Mount of Olives, and they ask Jesus a whole string of questions. When will you return? When will the end of the age be? When will you set up your kingdom? And stuff like that. And there's a number of those questions where Jesus says, well, I do not know when I will return, only the Father in heaven. So do get into your minds that there were certain things at this point in time that Jesus did not know. Now, it's a paradox because you've just heard Jesus give very specific details about what is going to happen in Jerusalem. So he knew that, but he doesn't know who's going to be given the place of honor, because he doesn't, to put it bluntly, if Jesus had known, when I get into my kingdom and I sit on my throne, the guy on the left is going to be this person and the guy on my right is going to be this person, and he could have said to James and John, "You're too late, fellas, those positions have been filled." And it would have carried more weight if he'd have been saying the names of the people who are going to be sitting on those seats. But Jesus is very clear, very specific, and he says, I can't tell you. That's a decision made only by the Father in heaven. Verse 24, when the 10 heard this, they were indignant with the two brothers, and Jesus called them together and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many." You see the follow-up to the whole idea of the first shall be last, the last shall be first. Now, Matthew doesn't mention James and John's mother by name. We believe it is Salome, and she comes with this request. And when you look at the request, there's a couple of things I want to point out to you which you may not immediately latch on to. Firstly, the request has within it a part that is good and a part that is bad. I was telling the guys I was playing golf with last week about an experience I had when I was at seminary. You know, we used to have these sermon classes, and everyone had to prepare a sermon, and then you had to deliver it before the class and before your professor and so on. And I remember delivering one which I was inordinately proud of. And the prof said to me at the end, well, he said it was good and it was original. Well, I thought that was pretty wonderful. But he went on to explain, he said, well, the bits that were good weren't original, and the bits that were original weren't any good. But in this answer, in this request, if you like, there's some things that are good. Firstly, it's clear if she's asking for special places for her sons, she believes Jesus is going to have a kingdom. She believes there's going to be positions of authority and power and position to fill. So she has a clear idea that Jesus is going to have a kingdom. Now, it's fair to say, you've got to be honest about this, it's fair to say they're thinking in terms of an earthly kingdom, not a heavenly kingdom. They're thinking in terms of, well, this is going to be a reintroduction of the throne of David, of an establishment of the new kingdom. You know, you had the United Kingdom under Saul, under David, under Solomon, and then the nation breaks into two. But they're thinking, well, Jesus is going to reestablish the Davidic covenant and the Davidic kingdom. And that Jesus had a destiny. And that it wasn't, what Jesus was establishing was not something ethereal or pie in the sky, that there was going to be a kingdom. And that his glory and his majesty was going to be recognized and established. Now that's the good part of it. She had faith in the destiny of Jesus. The bad news of it is that she's not focused on the glory of Jesus. Who is she focused on? The glory of her sons. Yes, she's pushing the boys forward and saying, now look, you're probably too shy to ask Jesus this, but you know, I'm your mother and I can do stuff like that because mothers can do that. And I'll ask him for a special favor. Now, there's lots of things you can say about a mother's love. A mother's love is special. A mother's love at its best is sacrificial because mothers will deny themselves things so that their children can have things, financially and in other ways. And I always think there's a special connection broadly between mothers and sons. Don't you think so? John Carter probably tell you that. In just the same way that I think there's a special connection between fathers and daughters. Wouldn't you agree? There seems to be that sort of closeness, that connection, and so on. And she comes looking for a special favor. She's looking for them to be at the center of power. When Jesus comes into his kingdom, make my boys the Secretary of State and the Secretary of the Treasury or whatever. And you know, people, if you think about it, historically, people have given up very, very much better jobs to go into a president's cabinet or into the White House. Because they're at the center of power. Because who knows what it might lead to, and you're privileged. The president has called you up and said, I would like you to be my Secretary of State, I would like you to be the head of the Treasury and all the rest of it, or whatever. For instance, in Jack Kennedy's administration, Dean Rusk was already president of the Rockefeller Foundation, and he was doing very nicely, thank you, and pulling down a very large salary, and Kennedy asked him to be in his cabinet, and he gave up being president of the Rockefeller Foundation and took it. Robert McNamara was pulling down an even bigger salary as the president of the Ford Motor Company, and he walked away from that to become Secretary of Defense. So she's asking for these special positions for her boys. Did you ever, I wonder, have you ever taken on a job, whether it was an actual job where you got paid for doing it, or whether it was a volunteer job, and looking back years later, you say, if I'd have known what was it involved, I would have said no. I would never have taken that on. I had no idea what I was taking on, and it turned out to be, oh, what a job. Did you ever do that? Yeah. And this is essentially what Jesus says to them. Are you sure? Look at verse 22. Firstly, he says, you don't know what you're asking. And then he says, can you drink the cup I'm going to drink from? Now, Jesus, the can you, the you, by the way, in that verse is plural. And he's looking at both the boys. And he's saying to them, can you drink the cup that I'm going to drink from? And he's saying to them, you've no idea. You're thinking in terms of power and position and influence and leadership and privilege. But if I took 10 minutes to explain to you what is involved in being my followers, you would run nigh and be back home before you know it. But they answer very lightly, very flippantly, very glibly. Oh, yes, we can do that. I mean, it's almost, have you ever agreed to something in an interview situation and you knew that you were really beyond your level of ability? You know, people say, well, have you had much experience in this? You know, oh, yes, lots. You know, because you want the job, you know, and you're saying, oh, yeah, I've done that so many times. And then you go home and Google it. You know, how do you do this? What Jesus is saying is, if you're going to be one of my followers, it's not going to involve prestige and honor and position and power and influence and, you know, it's going to involve suffering and humiliation and pressure like you wouldn't believe. And the cup, this is the same image that Jesus uses in the upper room. And it's the same image that Jesus uses in the Garden of Gethsemane. We saw it last Sunday. The cup of suffering, the cup of bitterness, the cup of death, and so on. And he says, can you drink of this cup? Meaning, you know, I'm going to go through all this. If you sign up for this, are you willing to go through all this? Are you willing to be put on trial? Are you willing to be crucified? Are you willing to be tortured? And so on. And they very glibly say yes. By the way, how many times have you ever heard something? You know, you always get this at question and answer sessions where someone standing where I'm standing says, there's no such thing as a stupid question. Have you heard people say that? There's no such thing, you know, just you go ahead and ask it. There's no such thing as a stupid question. I personally believe that there is such a thing as a really dumb answer. Because I've given a lot of them. And if you looked at my exam results, you would know that. But their answer to Jesus is very superficial. It's very flippant. It's very, oh yeah, we can handle that, you know. Randy, you want to say?
Yeah, well, I want to tell a little amusing story. I had a colleague, a teacher, who was also interested in performing shows. He was a performer as well. And he was trying out for a part in a show called Starlight Express.
Right.
Some of you might know it. It involves roller skating. And they asked him if he knew how to roller skate. We had no idea. Right away he says, yeah, sure, I've done it all my life. So now he was in the show, he learned how to roller skate after he said he would, but he didn't know how.
That's a very good example of somebody agreeing, oh yeah, I can do that. Yeah, I've done that so often. Jan?
On another level, I think the same is true for joining a church, being a Christian. You
Right.
don't have a clue how difficult that can be.
Yes.
Everybody's so excited, and you're just wonderful, and they say, oh my God, you know, I got to. It comes to you later.
Right.
It involves more than just the glory of the moment of doing it.
Jan's saying about people committing to Christ and joining a church and so on. And I have said this a number of times from here. We are, in the Christian churches, we're so eager to have new converts, we're so eager to have new people, that we dumb down the requirements, what it involves, and so on. Jesus never did. Look at the rich young ruler. Jesus always said, now, have you thought about this? You know, like on one other occasion, he talks about how you don't start to build a tower until you've worked out, well, can I afford this? How much is this going to cost? What's it going to require? And so on. He's saying, think about it beforehand. Don't just jump in with the, oh, yeah, this is fine. But in the Christian church as a whole, we're so eager to have new people come into the kingdom that we dumb it right down. Oh, it'll be easy. Well, it won't. And preachers are as guilty of that as anyone else. Now, I love, if you wanted an example of understatement in the New Testament, look at verse 24. But before we do that, let's go back to 23. Jesus looking into the future, knowing the life that the apostles are going to live, knowing how many of them are going to die for their faith, they're going to be martyred for their faith, and so on, he says, you will indeed drink from this cup. You know, this is they're answering with flippancy. Jesus is answering with certainty and saying, yes, you're right. You don't realize, you know, what's not in there, but what is implied is you don't realize it, but you will indeed drink from this cup. But to sit at my right hand or my left is not for me to grant. Those places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father. Now, here's the understatement. When the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. In the Greek, it doesn't really get across that they were livid. They were incandescent with rage. That's how they felt about James and John. Heather's niece, when she was 3, used to have a phrase in her little 3-year-old mind. This meant, you know, this was the worst. And she would say, my mom was cross and mad at me. It was always the combination of the cross and mad. You know, and sometimes she might say, well, my mom was cross at me because I said this. But when you got the two combined together, you knew she really was in trouble. When she said, my mom was cross and mad at me. So the other 10 are really, really livid about this. And you can imagine the taunts, can't you? You can imagine what they said to James and John. You can imagine how they stuck it to them when their mother had gone her way. But notice what Jesus says in verse 25. This again is going back to the first and the last, the paradox of the kingdom, the reversal of the natural order, and so on. Let me say it like this to you. The world does not see as God sees, nor does the world think as God thinks. And in these verses from 25 onward, Jesus is painting a picture on contrasting world leadership, world power, secular power and leadership, and spiritual power and leadership. What does he say? You know how the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. Their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus is saying, in the kingdom, there will be no jockeying for position. There'll be no shenanigans. There'll be no trying to get yourself into a certain position and having certain people back you. There'll be no clawing your way to the top. There must be, Jesus says, a servant spirit. Now, nowadays, whether it's a secular organization or a Christian organization, every organization has what we now call a mission statement. It sums up what they're all about. You know, Amazon have one, Apple have one, all the big companies have one. If you look into it, what's your mission statement? What's your main goal? What are you trying to do? What are you trying to achieve? Whether it's secular or not. This is Jesus' mission statement. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. If you look at Mark 10:45, it's exactly the same phrase. Jesus, again, uses this in Mark's gospel as his mission statement. I didn't come to be served. I didn't come to be treated like an earthly king, with people bowing before me and scraping and doing everything to suit me and putting me first. Jesus says, I didn't come to do all that. I came to serve and to give my life. Don't miss that bit. To give my life as a ransom. In Luke 19, you have the same idea, only he puts in, I've come to save the lost. I've come to rescue the lost sheep. But he's still a king. You know, Matthew is not losing sight of the kingdom aspect. Now, do you remember when Jesus appears before Pilate? And Pilate's intrigued by Jesus. He doesn't know what to make of him. And they brought him before Pilate on the only charge that was of any interest to the Romans, and that was that Jesus was setting himself up as a king, as the king of the Jews. That would involve the Romans saying, this is sedition. We're in charge of the country. Is this guy going to push himself forward and reestablish the kingdom and then raise an army and throw us out of the country? That would interest the Romans. That's why they put the charge to the Romans. I mean, if they came to Pilate and said, oh, this man is he's a blasphemer, he's a heretic, Pilate would say to them, well, go and sort that out in your religious courts. That's nothing to do with me. So they had to couch the charge against Jesus in terms of sedition, rebellion, troublemaker. You've got to deal with this guy because there'll be a riot if you don't. Now, they put this, and what does Pilate ask Jesus? Remember this? He says, are you a king then? You know, you can see him looking curiously at Jesus and saying, these guys say you're a king. Are you a king? He's curious. What does Jesus reply? Jesus doesn't deny. Jesus never says, no, I'm not the king of the Jews. What does he reply? He replies, well, yes, but not the sort of king you're thinking about. See? Not the sort of king you're used to. You think of Caesar. You think of all the pomp and ceremony and royal robes and glory and the armies and the battalions of soldiers and the control. But I'm not that kind of king. He doesn't say, well, I'm not a king at all. He says, I'm not that kind of king. I'm not your kind of king, is what he essentially says. I'm not the kind of king that you're familiar with. Now, again, we'll just close at this. Jesus is taking, let me get this right. Matthew is taking us back to a couple of prophecies in the Old Testament. And again, remember, he's a Jew writing to Jews to try and persuade them that Jesus is the promised Messiah. And so he's taking them back. When you go home, look at Isaiah chapter 53. It talks about the suffering servant. And Old Testament scholars before Jesus agreed that this was a picture of the Messiah But it was a puzzling picture for them, this idea of the Messiah not being victorious and strong and powerful and mighty, but the Messiah being willing to suffer. We read these familiar words. Verse 4, for instance, Isaiah 53. Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows. Yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by God, and afflicted. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. And by his wounds we are healed. And it goes on. Verse 7, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he didn't open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as like a sheep before his shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth, and so on. Now look at verse 9 if you're looking at it. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, although he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. There you have some specifics about the death of Jesus, which are given by Isaiah 700 years before Jesus was born. Think about that. Here's Isaiah the prophet, inspired by God to write down words that perhaps he fully didn't totally understand himself. But they picture an event 700 years in the future. And it deals with the specifics of the death. For instance, if you read Psalm 22, you'll have the same idea. Psalm 22, the psalm immediately before everybody's favorite psalm, the 23rd psalm, Psalm 22 is the psalm of the cross, because it describes in detail Jesus' death on the cross and the details of that death. And again, written hundreds of years before there was such a thing as crucifixion. So again, here is Jesus pointing out that he is a king, but he's not a king in the way that they really understand it. And as I say again, let me remind you of this. The world does not see as God sees, nor does the world think as God thinks. It's the whole thing of turning it upside down. Turning everything around. The idea of being a servant king, a suffering servant, is automatically a paradox in itself. Has anyone got any questions? No? Okay, I've stunned you into silence. Okay. Now, next time we're going to pick up at verse 29. And there's a couple of lovely and interesting things. Jesus is on the journey. He's got to Jericho. By the way, this is the Jericho, not the Jericho in the south, where the Israelites came across the Jordan River into Jericho and up. This is a Jericho which is north of Jerusalem. You probably never thought of that before. Because remember, he's coming down from the north. He's coming down from Galilee and that region in the north. And he's coming on a southern journey to go to Jerusalem for the last time. Galilee and Nazareth and so on, Capernaum's in the north. Jerusalem is here. So he's coming down. And he comes to this town called Jericho. There's a town called Jericho about 10 miles north of Jerusalem. There's also a much bigger town 17 miles south of Jerusalem. But he's coming from the north. He comes to this Jericho. The town is really not of much significance to the stories. But just so as you get it in your head, because he's not coming down and then going south, then going up. He's coming from the north, coming down, arrives at Jericho, a couple of interesting incidents there, and then he comes on down into Jerusalem in the last week of his life, on what we call Palm Sunday. And that begins the week, the final week. Okay, thank you everybody, but we'll pick it up at 29, Matthew 20, 29 next time.